Hello, everybody hear me? See if this is working. Okay. Let me just make sure everything is functional here. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Margaret. I'll be doing the Phonology and Orthography webinar for today. I'm going to try to make sure that you can all see this and that everything is working. Let's see. Oh, I just keep getting notifications about this. Okay. Hopefully everyone is able to see it. I'm going to start off with the phonology section, and it will be a little bit more advanced from what I did previously for this webinar series. And then we will talk about that. I'll try to look at the chat so that I can see if anybody's asking questions after that, and then we'll move on to the orthography section on writing systems. So let me share my screen of the slides first. And here is a little me in the corner, which will probably get in the way, but at least you can see me that way. Okay, so yeah, so this is going to be Phonology and Orthography Part 2. So a little bit more advanced, but still relatively fundamental to both of these areas. And I'll be talking about specifically addressing some ways that you can look at the phonology of a language that you're documenting that you may not know much about, or there might not be much info out there about. And then also addressing some ways that you can develop orthography for a language if it doesn't already have a standardized writing system. So let's get started. Yeah, we're basically just going to be looking at sound systems, which is the phonology part, and writing systems, the orthography part. So first I wanted to do kind of a review of some concepts. I wanted to make sure that we kind of just go over some of the basics that we talked about in the previous webinar series. If you weren't there for that, don't worry about it. We'll cover a lot of the basics here as well. So phonology is essentially a system of a language that's concerned with the patterning, often of sounds in spoken languages. And really what we're looking at here is focusing on the sounds of the language rather than the letters. So for a while in the first section of this, we're going to be forgetting about spelling systems, and then we're going to be remembering it again as we look at orthography. But one of the things that we use as linguists, we use the International Phonetic Alphabet to allow us to represent sounds of languages, also called the IPA, and here's its name in itself down here. And one nice thing about the IPA is it allows us to have a consistent one-to-one correspondence between sounds and symbols. And you will never have to guess how a particular sound is supposed to be written in the IPA because there's only one way to write a particular sound. It also allows anybody who's familiar with the IPA to know how to pronounce anything that's written in it. So if you're familiar with the symbols of the IPA, you see something written potentially in another language that you don't know, you'll at least have a clue on how to pronounce it, even if you don't know what it means, if you're familiar with the IPA system. So it's helpful to use the IPA when we're figuring out the phonology of a language, just to keep the sounds straight and not to get them confused with spelling, and so that we have a consistent way of representing it. So notice some differences here between English spelling of various words and the IPA, which I'm going to be putting in these flashes here. which is usually how I'll represent the phonemes or the sounds in the language. So in English spelling, you often have inconsistency in symbol and sound representation. So here we have the letter X, which actually is representing two sounds, the K and the S sound, X. But if you write it in the IPA, you can more transparently see what sounds are being used in this word. Same thing with like song here. We have these two letters representing one sound, this sort of velar nasal sound here. And then, oops, little face disappeared. There it is. And then, of course, we have these long words in English that actually consist of very few sounds, like the word though is part of the sort of infamous set of words that have seemingly a lot of extra letters in them. So here's the word written in the IPA, though. So if you look at these, you can see that there is a one-to-one correspondence between sound and symbol for the IPA, which is not something that you always get in the writing system of a language, especially not with a language with a writing system like English, where there are a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of sort of 2-to-1 correspondence or 1-to-2 correspondences, as we've seen with things like TH representing a single sound, or X representing two sounds, something like that. So we'll be using the IPA from here on out, but if you don't know all the IPA, that's okay. It's just something to start thinking about if you haven't before. Here, a reminder, is the IPA chart of consonants. These are all the pulmonic consonants, all the sort of basic consonants that you would see in any language. Here are some vowels, and you can look this up. If you need to find a version of this, you can just look it up online. If you just type IPA chart, you actually go to ipachart.com. There is a really handy version of this where you can actually click on the different symbols, and it plays a recording of what that sound is. So if you're new to the IPA, you'd like to practice with that a little bit, that is out there. There are other resources like that. Let me know afterwards if you're interested in any of those, and I can point you to the right URLs. And these are some non-pulmonic consonants, such as clicks. There's a whole variety of different things, but don't worry too much about knowing them or memorizing them at this point. They're just here as a reference or kind of a reminder about the system in general. Okay, so obviously not all languages are going to include all possible sounds. Most languages only have a subset of the sounds I've showed you here in the IPA chart, including English. So when you're looking at the phonology of the language you're approaching for documentation that maybe doesn't have any information out there about the phonology or about the sound system, it helps to kind of start with the IPA and try to find sounds on the IPA chart that you think correspond to the sounds that your language in question has. What's crucial to look for in the phonology are sounds that contrast. And what I mean by contrast is that they are considered two separate sounds that can distinguish meaning in a word if you were to replace it. So one easy way to figure out if something contrasts, the two sounds are in contrast, is to look for what's called minimal pairs. And minimal pairs are a set of words, a pair of words, that would differ only in one sound in the same position. So some examples in English of this would be like bat and pat, or lip and rip. So they differ only in one sound in the same position. In this case, it is the initial position in the word. So these contrastive sounds are called phonemes, and these are the basic sort of unit of phonology. And they are dependent on a particular language. So what is considered contrastive or distinguishable phoneme in one language is not always going to be the same as it is in another language. So these are things that are going to be particular to the language that you're working with. And so knowing what is a contrastive sound in another language isn't going to help you, but you'll have to rather look internally to that language's system to see which sounds are important to it. And phonemes are going to be sounds that in the minds of speakers of this language, they're going to be considered distinct. They're going to be considered meaningfully different. So what are some examples? Well, here are some examples in both Kala and English. Oops, this overlaps a little bit. Kala and English. So some examples in English are bit and pit, ran and ram, core and gore, sip and zip, and law and raw. So here we see a difference only in one segment, and it's in the same position. So if you switch it out, it changes the meaning of the word. The word's identity is now different. Here's some examples from Kala, which is a language that I've worked on in Papua New Guinea. We have boo, which means betel nut, or buai, and we have pu, which means ground. So changing a B for a P sound is making a difference in the meaning, so we can tell that those sounds are contrastive. Kala also is a language that contrasts nasalized vowels. So a nasalized vowel is something like an as opposed to a, where a little bit of the sound, the air is released through the nasal passage. So if you say this word wan in Kala, it means canoe. If you use a nasalized vowel, that's what the little tilde above the vowel indicates. But if you say a plain vowel, wa, it means uncle. So if you change that particular sound, you create a difference in meaning, which means that for Kala specifically, nasalization is contrastive for vowels. So it is something that is considered distinct in Kala. Same with kuri. Kuri means octopus, but kuri with a nasalized vowel means reef. Same with sa, meaning up, versus da, meaning house. And here you can't really see it, unfortunately, but the word mba means no, with an MBA, versus ba, meaning mountain. So these are sounds that can distinguish different words, meaning they're really likely to be different phonemes in their respective languages, and they are. So whether or not a sound is a phoneme, like I said, is really dependent on the individual language. So something that is a phoneme in English is not guaranteed to be a phoneme in any other language, and vice versa. Like nasalization in vowels is not something that changes the meaning of a word in English, but in Kala and in other languages like French, it does. So another way to tell if two sounds are different phonemes is to see if they occur in complementary distribution. And what this means is that these two sounds that are phonetically similar, like T and D, right, they are both produced in the same part of the mouth, alveolar ridge. They're both stop consonants, stop all the air coming out. They differ in that T is voiceless, so you don't activate the vocal cords, but D is voice. You do activate the vocal cords. So they're a little different from each other, but they're also quite similar. So something is phonetically similar, and in complementary distribution, it means that they occur in mutually exclusive phonetic environments. So for example, if you always saw T at the beginning of a word and nowhere else, and you always saw D not at the beginning of a word, then it would mean that they're in complementary distribution. They're mutually exclusive environments where these are found. So if they do occur in complementary distribution and they're phonetically similar, then it's likely that these are actually allophones of the same phoneme. And allophones are basically phonetic variants, and they all exist under this umbrella category of the same phoneme. So they aren't considered distinct sound categories in the mental phonology of a speaker of this language. And once again, this is really just going to depend on the language system itself. Every phonology system is language specific. So what do I mean by all this? What are some examples? Well, in English, We might see many phonetic variants of a P-like sound. We might see plain P. We might see P that's aspirated with this little H up there. It just means it has like a little puff of air occurring after it. We might see P that is unreleased. That is, you form a P and just never let it go. You just go hup, like that. So you might ask, are these all separate phonemes in English? Or are these all allophones of the same phoneme? Are these phonetic variants of the same category? Well, first you can try to find minimal pairs. You can say, do I see in English any examples of, say, a word pie and a word spy and a word with somehow an unreleased initial P, which is impossible. I just have to say and then I. So it's not a very good example. But if you can't find any minimal pairs, if you can't find any examples where replacing one of these for the other would change the meaning of a word, you can try to see if they are in complementary distribution. So let's look at in English where these sounds tend to occur. So the aspirated P, the P with a little puff of air, like P, you can actually tell if you hold your hand up in front of your mouth and say pie or pin or poke or porter, as I've listed here. If you say these words, you can notice a little aspiration, and these tend to occur at the beginning of a stressed syllable. Oh, this one should have a little H as well. These tend to occur at the beginning of a stressed syllable, but they don't tend to occur in a lot of other positions. Unreleased P, that is a P that does not have the stop release into an open mouth shape, like puh, that tends to occur sometimes at the end of a word or before another stop. So if you say like dip or stop, then that would be considered an unreleased P. So these are mutually exclusive environments, right? They are not the same. You don't get an unreleased P at the beginning of a stressed syllable, and you would not get an aspirated P necessarily at the end of a syllable. You could, I suppose, if you really over-enunciated it, but typically you don't in normal speech. So plain P, as I'm calling it, occurs elsewhere in all other phonetic environments. So here it is at the beginning. Here it is in a stressed syllable, but it's not the beginning, right? There's an S here. So spider. Here it is at the beginning of an unstressed syllable, trample. So here you get regular P. So the environments, the phonetic environments, or the sort of places where they occur in the language, are mutually exclusive. And this means that they are in complementary distribution. And so because they are in complementary distribution, they occur in mutually exclusive places, mutually exclusive phonetic environments, we can conclude that all of these P variants are actually not different phonemes in English, but they are allophones of the same phoneme. These are all variations on a phoneme. And a lot of times a phoneme may have a lot of different allophones, or sometimes it may only have a minimal number. It might only have 2, or even just 1. It's possible for it to only have 1 allophone. And typically when you have an allophone, you will write it in brackets to represent the phonetic details of it, like this. And when you have a phoneme by itself that represents the whole category, you write it in slashes. So here I could say that P in slashes is the phoneme, the sort of category that English speakers consider to be distinct, whereas these allophones I would write with brackets around them, like this, PH. Okay, so with that, let's look at some data from another language and see if we can find some separate phonemes or allophones of the same phoneme. So I have some data from the language called Gascon. And this is a language spoken in southwestern France, in the Gascony region. And in this data, we see some sets of stops and fricatives. So for stops, we see B, D, and G, so G, B, D, and G. And then we see corresponding fricatives, which correspond to V, the, and R. So we see these three pairs, and it's possible that these represent separate phonemes each. And it's also possible that they are both phonemes of the same, or they're both allophones, rather, of the same phoneme. So we'll look at this data, and if you have any guesses about whether these are separate phonemes or whether they constitute allophones of the same phoneme, make a note in the chat if you have any answers or questions about this little problem set, and I will try to look at it in just a moment. But here are our data from Gascon. Here's a set of words. So we do see B's. There are B's here. We do see the fricative form of the B written as a beta, V. This is a bilabial voiced fricative, V, kind of like a V, but not quite. We do see D's, right? Here, many D's. We also see the voiced fricative, the, here as in pouvait, buvette, échafaud. So we do see both of those. We do see the velar stop, g, aiguan. And we do see the fricative, the velar fricative, jurette, or rigout, or bizarre. So we do see both, but the task here is to figure out whether those sets are in complementary distribution. Do they occur in mutually exclusive phonetic environments, or are they separate phonemes? So one clue to starting a problem like this is to notice what types of sounds are around the segments in question. So here we have a B that is surrounded by an M sound and an O sound. Here we have a B that is surrounded by an M and an R. Here we have a word initial B, another word initial B before an R. So if you can kind of look at the patterns here, it can become easier to make a conclusion about whether they occur in the same types of environments or not. So I will let you look at this and try to look at the chat, see if anybody is saying things. Here we go. So does anybody have any ideas about the patterns in this set? We look at some of the words, can see that our B, our stop, occurs in a lot of different environments, right? We see it between a consonant and a vowel. We see it at the beginning of a word, between two consonants here. And then the fricative version, the bilabial fricative, the V sound, we see in these words salivo, novi, ave. These tend to occur, from what we see in this data set, between two vowels. So this is E and O, this is O and E, this is A and A, right? We see it between E and A here as well in the word for horse, cheval. So it is occurring in a different kind of specific environment from the plain B. And if you look at the D's versus the sound, which is written as this D with a little hook over it, you can see that the case is actually the same for these. So you can see plain D in many different environments, right? Here we see it between a consonant and a vowel at the beginning of a word. Here it is between a vowel and another consonant, beginning of a word. Let's see, any other examples? That's all the D's in here. But if you look at the sound, you can notice that it is between U and E. It is between U and E. It's between A and O over here. So if you can make a generalization about that, it would be that it's between two vowels. So far, we've seen the fricative member of these sets between two vowels, which is called intervocalic. It's between two vowels. And the stop version is in both of these sets, we've seen in all other environments, right, in all other cases. So just to sort of sum up about this to make sure that this is accurate, let's look at the final version, or the final set, which is the G sound, the G written as a G, and the R, which is written here, the gamma. So G versus R is going to be our third set to look at. So if we look at where G occurs, we see beginning of the word, between these consonants. We see it at the end of a word as well. We see between a vowel and a consonant. And then for the R, this one, we see it between an E and an A, between an E and an U, and we also see it between an U and an E. So these are, once again, all vowels. So it tends to be the pattern that the fricative version of these sets is occurring between vowels, and the stop version is occurring in all other phonetic environments, all other places that you could see it happening. So what does that tell us? It tells us that these two sets of sounds in all of these cases are in a complementary distribution. And if two sounds are in complementary distribution, they're both occupying mutually exclusive spaces in words, then that is a good indication that they are actually not separate phonemes, but they are allophones of the same phoneme. They are phonetically conditioned, depending on where they are in a word and what other kinds of segments are around them. So this is one way to figure that out. If you can't find minimal pairs, you can look and see if you can find sounds that are in complementary distribution. So those are our data from Gascon. So yeah, this is basically the questions that we already answered. Looking at, trying to observe patterns that have to do with the surrounding segments around stops versus those around the fricative. We found out that the fricative versions only occur between vowels and the stop versions occur elsewhere. So based on this, we can say that these pairs are indeed allophones of the same phoneme and not separate phonemes, because they are in complementary distribution. So this means that speakers of Gascon consciously would not consider the and b to be different sounds, even though they do have phonetic differences. They're considered versions of the same thing in their mental phonology, in their sort of mental system of how they think about the language. But there might be another language somewhere where the and b are completely separate phonemes. It just depends on the language entirely. So that's why when you approach phonology, you really have to look at the context of this internal system of language to see what that particular language does and how it patterns its different sounds. Okay, so far I've been talking about segments of sounds, but that's not all there is to it. There are something called suprasegmentals, things that are above the segment, and some of the most common versions of this, or common examples of this, are tone and stress. And these are also phonological systems that are important to consider when you are starting to document a language, to figure out how these systems work. Lexical tone is used by over half of the world's languages, in fact, to distinguish meaning in words. So Chinese languages do this, right? Depending on the tone, and the diacritic here in the pinyin will tell you what the different tones are, that will distinguish the meaning of a word. So these are essentially all minimal pairs, right? They're a minimal set because they are distinguished only by one thing, but that one thing here is tone rather than a separate segment. So when looking to see if your language has distinctive tone, it helps to do something like this, to try to come up with words that are otherwise the same except for maybe tone on the vowel. So whether it has a low tone, a high tone, sometimes there are falling tones or rising tones. Languages can have lots of tones, 6, 7, 8 tones, or it could only just have 2 tones, high and low is what you usually see for low numbers of tones. And this is a very common thing throughout the world. In fact, it's estimated that 60 to 70% of the world's languages are tonal, but they tend to cluster in certain parts of the world a little bit more sometimes. So that is tone, which is a suprasegmental. Another suprasegmental that's very common is stress. Stress syllables tend to be more acoustically prominent. They're more noticeable. They tend to be longer, louder, tend to be higher in pitch, and just overall more prominent than an unstressed syllable. Some languages have predictable stress, like you always know where the stress goes in a word. Like you could say it's always the second to last syllable in a word. But many languages don't have predictable stress. And so in English, stress is not necessarily predictable in any given situation. And it can also be used to distinguish one word from another. So if you look at these words down here, we have record, which is a verb, an action, right, versus record. And the only difference here in the phonological system is going to be where you put the stress. In the IPA, we use this little thing that looks sort of like an apostrophe that comes before a stressed syllable. So this one indicates record, while this one is record, the noun, right? Like I have a record that I recorded, right? And notice, extra tidbit, in English, unstressed syllables often have their vowels turned into a schwa, right? This sound. So if it's unstressed, you tend to see a schwa, right? Unstressed here, unstressed there. That's sort of a secondary feature of what stress can do in English specifically. So stress can do a lot. So when you're documenting tone or stress, one strategy is to look for minimal pairs that contrast only in tone or stress, such as record and record. Or, for example, the single syllable words in the Chinese example that all differ only by their tone. If your language happens to have a lot of monosyllables or single syllable words, it can be a lot easier to do this than if your language's words are very long, but it's still doable either way. But in any respect, whether you're working with something that is a segment of sound or a suprasegmental feature, looking for minimal pairs is always a really great way to start. It's often a simple way to start, and it can be fun to find words that rhyme. Typically, those are going to be minimal pairs in many respects, like dip and sip and lip and rip. Those are all minimal pairs, and they also all rhyme. So that's kind of handy in that respect. But not all phonologies actually involve sound. If you are working with a signed language, you will also see phonological elements, but of course they won't involve sound, but other elements that will pattern and make contrasts in that language. So, for example, signs in American Sign Language can be distinguished with different features, just the way that sounds can be distinguished whether with certain features, like whether or not they have voicing, right? Like T versus D might be a distinctive feature for sounds in English. Things like location, which refers to where the sign is actually produced. hand shape, which is the shape that your hand is actually in to make the sign. Orientation, which is which way it's facing, which way is the sign facing when you do it. Movement, which involves moving during the sign's production. And also non-manual expression. So do you have to do something with your face simultaneously to doing something with your hands? So these are all things that can distinguish separate signs that mean different things. So similarly to the phonology of a spoken language, you're going to be looking for features that make contrastive differences. What is something that when you change it, it changes the meaning of a word? Those are things that you're going to look for. So the principles are really the same, whether you're working with a signed language or a spoken language. You're looking for contrastive differences, differences that matter, basically, for the system. So there are examples of words in ASL that will be minimal pairs, basically, where you change one of these aspects of it, like you change the location of where you do a sign on the body, and it changes the meaning completely. I can show you some videos of those if anyone's interested afterwards. So I'm going to stop there to see if anybody has any questions. I'll look at the chat real quick. This is the end of the phonology section. So anybody who is interested, oh yeah, someone says, please explain schwa. So schwa is a little vowel, and by little I mean it is very often indistinguishable sometimes if you speak quickly. It is a central mid-vowel, which means that your mouth is open midway, your tongue is in the center of the mouth. It is the sound that you hear, it's the first syllable of the word about. It's just basically it's no mouth movement. You just don't change anything. Your mouth is essentially at a neutral position, and you just make a vowel sound. So that is schwa, and it's all over English, and often appears in syllables that are not stressed. So like about. Stress is on the second syllable, so the vowel in the first syllable becomes a schwa. It's the same sound as in like around, the first syllable, or if you were to say contemplate, the second syllable, the tum, that is a schwa, contemplate. So it's often kind of easy to get sort of swallowed up in certain words. Sometimes it gets deleted. Sometimes is just very short, essentially. Oops, I'm in the wrong place. There we go. I got lost. Yeah, so if some of the terms are unfamiliar, feel free to let me know. Obviously, don't have to memorize all these different things here today. Some of this is just sort of a review of last time as well. So does anybody else have any questions on stuff that we talked about here before we move on to orthography? Let's see here. Okay. Okay, yeah, so some of the things I did cover in the intro session for phonology and orthography, so some of this harkens back to that, and there's also some new info here. So since we do have recordings of these, you can always go back and listen again if you need to, or if you missed something. So that will be posted up here, I believe, after this is over. So if you missed it, you can go back and look. What is the best way to learn symbols of the IPA? Well, in my opinion, I like to associate symbols with the audio production of them, basically the acoustics. So one thing you can do is you can go to, I believe it is IPAchart.com. I'll put this link here. I believe that's what it is. I was just showing it to some students earlier. IPAchart.com, I believe, is a way you can learn